Καλησπέρα.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the 17th International Book Fair of Thessaloniki, that this year is, as you probably have already understood, online, we wish to inform you that this afternoon we'll be having a great discussion, hopefully, with the Swedish writer Niklas Nat Odag. I apologize if I misspelled your name. For his historic books named 1793 and 1794. Along with the writer, we'll have his translator, Mr. Grigoris Kondilis, who will help us to learn more about the books of the notorious Swedish writer. Now, the two books that are published in Greece, 1793 and 1794, are two books that have different levels to be understood and read. I would say that are, let's say, polymorphic, if I dare to say Greek word, books. They refer to the life, to the society of Sweden, of course, in 1793 and 1794, and through some police, let's say, aspects, but at the same time, he manages to present quite some social issues and aspects of the life in Sweden. I wish to welcome Niklas. Good afternoon, Niklas, from Athens, Greece. I hope you're doing fine.
Thank you for having me.
Καλησπέρα και στο...
Good afternoon also to Grigoris Kondilis from Aghrinion, a city in the around 200 kilometers from Athens. It's a translator of the book. Now, I guess we're all ready to embark into a beautiful conversation, discussion with Niklas, because the type of books that Niklas writes, I dare to say, is innovative, is unique, and I don't think that there's something similar in this type of police historic fiction. So allow me to start with the first question to Niklas, and also Grigoris, you can intervene at any moment if you wish. Now, my first question to Niklas is the following. Niklas, your book, how would you characterize it? I mean, do you think it's a police fiction? Is it a historic book? Is it a social book? Is it I don't know, a mixture of all these things? Or is it something else at a total different dimension?
That's a difficult question. But for me, really, the first inspiration was a book by Umberto Eco called The Name of the Rose. And I remember reading that when I was quite young. And to me then, it was a very exciting thriller about weird murders in a medieval monastery. And I thought it was really exciting. And then I reread it as an adult several years later. And I couldn't believe how much of a history lesson and how much of a philosophical study of the medieval mind that it is. And I was very fascinated that Umberto Eco was so skillful as a writer that he could include both those dimensions without either one getting in the way of the other. So for a young boy, it was an exciting story. For an older man, it was really interesting, the historical aspects, and like he examines the position of humor in the Catholic religion. Can you joke about God and so forth? So rather sort of stupidly, I wanted to aim for something similar. So I wanted it to be an exciting novel and also a history lesson, and kind of a different history lesson about this time in Swedish history, which is kind of remembered as a cultural golden age rather than the sort of terrible time you see in the book. And I was, of course, I thought I would fail on both counts. I thought that it would be too boring for the thriller readers and too sort of too vulgar for the historical buffs. So I was kind of counting on a double failure. So I was very surprised with what happened.
Αυτό που ήθελα να πω είναι ότι το εξής.
What I wanted to say, Niklas, is the following. it seems that aside Umberto Eco, that you just referred to, there are some great trilogies. For example, the Berlin trilogy of Philippe Guerre, the trilogy Winter of Leif Persson, who is also, of course, from Sweden, and he talks about the Olof Palme killings. But of course, these are like 40 years ago. But your actual argumentation, if I dare to say, is much more bold, because we go back to, let's say, 200, 230 years in an era where we do not have, let's say, concrete data, and that you, I guess you managed through your own research, you were in a position to bring back to life. So what was the incentive for you to talk about a society which was about 200 to 230 years ago? So do you believe that this society has some analogies, some references, some similar social phenomena that can be combined with today's Sweden?
Yes, I guess that, I mean, during the 18th century, the ideas started to form that sort of turned into modern Western civilization. So it's a very sort of fertile ground for an author to sort of examine the natural friction between the ideas of the Enlightenment and what came before, which is a very unjust feudal society where you're born to play a certain part in life, and it's almost impossible to get away from it. And at the same time, as you mentioned, for instance, Leif GW Persson's trilogy, there's a long noir tradition in Sweden that sort of merges crime fiction and some sort of critique of society. So I wasn't really aware I was doing that, but in a historical setting. But maybe that sort of merging of different fictions in Sweden is so well established that it sort of occurred to me naturally. But I mean, rather sadly, having studied history, my view is that, I mean, on the surface, many things have changed, and we're all, I'm certain, very grateful for dental care and pain anesthetics, and hopefully very soon for a corona vaccine for all of us. But human nature basically remains the same, and I don't think we have grown any wiser or less of a predator than we have ever been as a species. So in a way, the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history.
Νομίζω ότι σε αυτή τη...
I believe that at this moment, Grigoris, as a translator, you should also make an intervention, because I believe that a very good translator knows the book and the writer more or less in the same way as the actual writer. You have read the book, you have translated the book, so I need to hear your experience, and if possible, have some questions for Niklas, some questions that you might have understood through your work. Well, good afternoon, Niklas. My first question is, at some of your interviews that I read, especially related to the book 1793, you say that one of the things you had to learn upon writing the book was the fact that it was not possible to write in the language of the 18th century, because this, according to your own words, it is something a rather difficult and demanding process. So I thought that in order to write about habits, situations, status, things related to that period, to the 18th century, even discussions between your characters in the actual book, you must include not at least the actual language of the 18th century in Sweden, but at least some, I don't know, historical words. Like, I don't know, buildings, names, political events, foods, garments, shops, transportation, police, and many other things that are part of the 18th century society. And I'm referring, for example, to the word bärstol. That for this particular word, the word bärstol, I use two words, the word sedia and the word palatino, which are rather old Greek words. I had to make quite some research. So all of those words that you used, aren't they actually a usage of that kind of language of the 18th century, at least via the actual usage of these words that you said that it was difficult for you to apply, to use? I don't know if you understood my question, Niklas, says your translator.
I've had quite some contact with Grigoris, which is very nice. Actually, it's not. There's just a handful of translators that sort of get in touch with me personally and start asking questions, which is it's really good. It sort of sometimes I can help, and sometimes it's a question that I feel, wow, maybe I made a mistake here, and then I have to check it out, and hopefully I didn't. And in particular, Grigoris solved a mystery for us, which is in the book 1794. It's to do with a certain coin used in the Caribbean called I just took it from a source, and I didn't think more of it. It's about the price of a slave, which is a muit, which sounds very French to me. And I just used it in the book, and a lot of translators asked me about this. What is this coin? And I couldn't answer, and nobody could answer. But Grigoris actually did the research and found out what it was. So I'm very happy about that. But as for the question, the Swedish language has evolved a lot during the last 250 years, and actually the Swedish Academy, which was established in 1770s, they started to sort of standardize spelling of the Swedish language, which was, there wasn't even a spelling, a correct spelling of words. Everything was written phonetically. So you can basically read texts from this time, but it gets quite difficult. And also due to a lot of political change in Sweden, the way you speak has changed a lot, which is very interesting to see the connection between language and politics. I mean, for instance, we did away with honorifics. Before the sort of the 40s and 50s, I would refer to Grigoris as Mr. Translator. I wouldn't address him directly as you, but due to socialism and social democracy in Sweden, it was decided that we should not have so obvious class differences. Everybody should address everybody in that way. So the first draft I wrote was actually very closer to 18th century language, but I sent that out to a lot of publishers, and it took me a long time to get this novel published. Nobody wanted it at first. And sometimes I would have sort of a rejection letter with a personal review, and they would say, this is not really readable. And the dialogues everybody would be addressing, you would say, oh, my brother, would you like a cup of aquavit here? Which sounds very, very anachronistic in Swedish today. So I was given the advice to just, you can't do that. Try to make it a little more palatable to a modern audience. But of course, you have to sort of invent a language to do it. And the sort of language you find in my books, it's closer to the language of the 1950s, maybe, in Sweden. Or maybe the early 20th century. That's kind of the way, and trying to do that I think I found a much richer language. People wrote better back then. There's a sort of a geometry of language which implies a relationship between different phenomena that I find marvelous. That's sort of, it's just gone in modern Swedish. So that's it's quite sad. But of course, when you use contemporary 17th century expressions like barstol or gevaldiger, which is an archaic sort of low-ranking police officer. I think you have to be very careful because I want those words there, but if you do it too much, the reader will say, what is this? I'm confused and now I'm angry and I will stop reading this book. So there's an economic that you sort of have to find for yourself. And of course there's editors, which maybe, if you're lucky, they will tell you, this is just gibberish, what you've written, redo it. And often they're right, then you can do it again.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Niklas. But what I wanted especially to say, and I refer to the word bärstol, is that myself, I had to find a word that would come from that period. Whereas the word that you used are words that so I wish also to say that as far as the start of the 20th century, that you say that we have lost Sven Bergman, another great writer, one of the best, I believe, writers of that period who would use the language in a magnificent way. So the next question is the following. Whenever you create your characters, do you believe that you're actually showing part of yourself? You're actually disclosing part of yourself? And is it something, let's say, pleasant for you as an experience? Or, let's say, is it an experience that you don't really like, that you don't appreciate?
About that, and I think that there's, of course, there's parts of me in all my characters, but my theory is that creating a character will let you explore that side of your personality, which is sort of the main trait of the character. And furthermore, I think that the ultimate fate of the character will tell you something about how you feel about that part of yourself. And the clearest example of that is that in 1793, there's a character called Christopher Blix, who is a young, drunk, naive fool who gets into a lot of trouble. And he is a portrait of myself at that age. And also, I don't want to spoil anything, but it doesn't go well for him. And I'm very happy I'm not that person anymore. So at least for that character, that theory works out. And now, as I write the third part, I'm sad to say there's a lot of similarities between me and the main villain in the book. But we may talk about that later, maybe.
Yes, it's something I really thought about as a last question, in other words, to have a few words about the book that you're actually writing now, your new book. Now, another question that I wish to ask. There was a TV interview you gave in Sweden, and the presenter, female presenter, I remember, she said that upon reading 1793, you might feel all the flavors, all the essences you describe. We can actually smell the odors, not always beautiful and good smells, but bad sometimes. And I remember that you were rather amazed. So how good is it, according to you, for a writer to make the reader to feel what the actual writer wants to transmit. So probably it's a rhetorical question, but it would be great to hear your view.
It's, the magic of literature to me has always been sort of the transfer of emotions, one way or the other. And I remember when I was very young, I was quite a lonely child, and I started to read a lot due to that. It was sort of accompanied to me. And it was amazing to me that you can read a book written by somebody who died several hundred years ago, and it will make you cry or laugh, but by some magic, that emotion is transmitted from one person to another, regardless of time and space. And from that age, which was maybe, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, 11 maybe, it was obvious to me that being a writer is sort of like being a magician, and it's the greatest thing you can ever hope to be. So I always wanted that, and I never thought about making people smell the horrors of the non-hygienic gutter Stockholm. But I wanted to describe it to make it as alive as possible. And the only way to do that is, of course, to do your research. You read a lot until you sort of create a virtual model of the city in your head where you can walk around together with the characters you have created and try to imagine how they would experience it. So the smell part is very weird, because when my wife got pregnant, she got very sensitive to smell. So everything that smelled was banned from the house. You couldn't wear perfume. And I didn't care about it because I don't have a great sense of smell. So I was really surprised that many people tell me, yeah, you can really smell the shit in your book. And I was like, wow, I didn't, that's surprising. But apparently that happens. The funniest thing that ever happened to me as a reader interaction was a woman that came up to me in Amsterdam, and she read the book, and she came up to me and she said, you know, I was reading your book when I was having breakfast, and it was that scene where that guy cuts out that other guy's tongue, and I threw up a little in my mouth. And I was quite embarrassed and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ruin your meal or anything. That's not why I became a writer." And she said, "No, it's a compliment to your writing." And I thought, wow, that's a weird compliment, but I'll take it.
Yes.
It is quite known that you come from one of the last aristocrat families, noble families of Sweden. So leaving aside the books, leaving aside the image of Carl Michael Bergman in his poems, the books that you were supplied to read, to conduct your research and study in order to draft your own books, were they books that were already in your family library? The family of your, I don't know, your relatives. So, and I'm asking that because I know that the book by Frassen about Barthélemy is tagged on the internet $3,000 US, and in the Academia net 25,000 Swedish crowns. In other words, 2,500 euros. In Antikvariatnet, says the speaker, he corrects himself. So do you have access to some major books? Did you manage to see these books and read them before writing your trilogy, before writing your own books?
Well, I wish that we had sort of a castle with a family library that goes back hundreds of years. But unfortunately, the clan Natt och Dag, we were major power players back in the sort of the 15th and 16th century. But Now, we had one of the greatest fortunes ever amassed in Swedish history, but then unfortunately one happy-go-lucky guy inherited the whole fortune, and when he died there was nothing left. So since the end of the 17th century we've been dirt poor. So all the castles and all the lands and everything else, I think my dad inherited the last of the family silver for eating, forks, and he was like 20 at the time. So he quickly went to the pawn shop with that and converted it all into cheap wine. And that was sort of the last of it. So there was no library, unfortunately. But actually, you're very lucky if you decide to write a historical novel in this day and age, because many, many sources are now digitalized. And not only that makes them easily accessible, but also they become searchable. So if you're looking for a particular detail, which can be incredibly frustrating, in particular when you know you read this somewhere, and now you want to use it in your text, but you can't find it anymore. You don't remember where you read it, and you don't really want to wing it because maybe you misremembered or sort of misinterpreted the whole thing, so you need to find it, and now you can. So for me, I have no sort of academic historical background, so I needed to learn everything about this age, and I decided quite early that for the only reason that all the books that I really fell in love with have been overworked to the point of insanity. I loved The Lord of the Rings when I was a child, and when you read The Lord of the Rings, you get to the appendices, and there's like family trees of all the chieftains of Rohan, and nobody's interested in that. But for some reason, I realized that, okay, for the author, for Tolkien, these 3 books are just the tip of the iceberg of his creation, and for some reason, that is what makes them great. So I decided, let's try to make it as faithful as possible. So I started going past all the secondhand bookstores I could in Stockholm, and every time I passed one, I would go in and I would basically buy everything they had on this era and historical Stockholm. And most of those books did not cost 25,000 euros or something. They cost next to nothing, because used books are extremely cheap here. And those really expensive books of which you speak, I had to go to the Royal Library here in Sweden, and that was sort of my only thing that I really, the one time I felt really authentic as a historical writer, because you sort of need to contact the library beforehand, and you need to order the books up to a closed little room where you have to show ID. They give you a pair of white gloves, and if you have sort of an ink pen, you have to leave it, and they will give you a lead pencil instead. And you get a little chain wrapped in fabric that you can put on the book so you don't sort of make any marks on it. And I felt that was really cool to me. Nobody else at the time. It was just me and researchers, and they didn't find it quite as cool as I did. But I dressed up for it. I had like a tweed overcoat with leather patches on the elbows.
Νίκλας, να σταθούμε λίγο στο...
Nicholas, should we talk a bit about the actual research? This is a very important, actually, topic. I have many questions for people that have read your books. People who say that in order to write a police fiction book, you will conduct a research that might have a certain duration, and then upon reading the book, you might have to add some gaps in your research. So my question is the following. We said about 230 years ago, for example. So my question is, could you actually explain what is the scheduling, the diagram, how many time and how much time did it take for you to conduct your research, and whether your research was continued upon writing the book? So what was the background research you conducted? How much time did it take for you to conduct the research? Because you said that you had to make some researches in all libraries, in the Royal Swedish Library, and this took you quite some time. So how much time did you spend conducting your research?
It's hard to say now after the fact, but I think I started a long time before I actually started writing the book, because as I mentioned, I've always dreamed of actually writing a book. But the more you go around and you have such a dream, the more terrifying it can be to actually sit down and write something, because you run the risk of proving that it's no good, and you have no talent, and you were never destined to sort of become a writer in the first place. So I was really scared to actually sit down, and a cowardly way to process that fear was doing the research, because it sort of felt like preparing to write. And the fact that my debut novel was a historical novel was actually very helpful, because I could do a research and feel like it was a part of the work. So I began reading up on it maybe 2 or 3 years before actually sitting down to to write. And of course, I had to do the sort of detailed research for every single scene during the actual writing. And writing the first draft took me 1 year. And then it took me a further 3 years to have it published. And during those 3 years, I rewrote it maybe 6 or 7 times. So it's difficult to measure time. I mean, I had to do work to pay my rent at the same time. So I can't really appreciate. I mean, it's 5 or 6 years of research during my spare time.
Θα ρωτήσεις, θα συνεχίσεις με τις 2 ερωτήσεις.
I think I have 2 more questions. Grigoris, do you want to ask them now? And I can actually add a final question at the end, says translator Mr. Kondilis. Allow me to ask you, Niklas, whether the Ikosetom character is based on a historical personality of the Swedish society. And if not, what was your source of inspiration to create such a sadist character in your actual book?
I can't really answer that question without spoiling or giving a preview of 1795. But my inspiration, I mean, it is a fact, of course, that the nobility of the time were, I mean, they had a lot of leeway to do and act as they want, because the poor had no rights whatsoever in comparison. So I felt it was theoretically possible for such a character to exist, but the inspiration came from the writings of the Marquis de Sade, of course. And he was supposed to sort of be a libertine. And the fact that 1794 doesn't really get a proper ending, it continues into the last book. And to sort of to deal with the character of Tycho Seton, I have to leave his motivation sort of a mystery. And I have mixed feelings about that, because the thing I hate worst in crime fiction is villains without a proper motive for what they're doing. And usually, if it's a serial killer, the explanation will be along the lines of, "Oh, he's just evil." And there is an explanation for what this villain does, and that explanation goes along the lines of there's a mention, he has actually read himself the one book by de Sade, which was actually available at the time, Justine, which came out in 1791 in the first version, and that book is sort of mentioned in passing as a part of his possession. And he tries to model himself after the ludicrous, non-realistic character of the libertines of Marquis de Sade. But he's actually someone else entirely, which we will find out in the last book.
Okay. Τώρα, Γρηγόρη,
Now, Gregory's, do you have anything else you wish to ask? Or should I say a few words? Oh, allow me to say, Grigoris, that I want to ask something to Niklas, because I was really impressed with the fact that there was a reference and a similarity with today's Swedish society. That's what I said earlier. So, Niklas, I think that you're describing in both your books a noble class, the so-called aristocrats, that are actually reigning on the lives of the people. So these rich people do whatever they want, they do orgies, they are sadists. So we see that people who are rather poor, they live humiliated, and their only interest is to be able to survive. They live under totally indecent conditions. They might do anything to survive. So I see that there is a great stratification of classes between, let's say, power and poor. In other words, between exploitants and exploited. And as you very, very well vividly describe in your book, is something very intense in the Swedish society back then. Do you see any similarity with today's Swedish society? In other words, is there a social class that decides, and there are the low-class people in Sweden that try to survive in today's Sweden, in today's Swedish society?
Sure. I think basically those distinctions will be sort of eternal, whatever society you look at in the history of humanity. There will always be. And I mean, if you if you go back to reading like Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, you will stumble upon an essay called "On the Origins of Inequality," which sort of sums this up perfectly. It's not possible to avoid, and certain people will always be drawn to power, and power will always corrupt. And as for Sweden of today, I guess so, but I wouldn't go so far as say that there's a sort of a hidden society of higher-ups that sort of exploit the weak in the way that is described in my books. In that case, they're hiding it pretty good, but then they would do, wouldn't they? But rather, when I was writing this, and you come upon a character like Jeffrey Epstein, who is a multimillionaire and decides that he needs to have an island of his own full of underage sex slaves, then that is pretty similar to what I'm describing in my book. So it does exist. And of course, while I was writing this, the whole catastrophe of the Swedish Academy happened, which was traumatic for any lover of literature, where these people who should be made of marble, they should dedicate their whole lives to loving literature, but it sort of turns out to be just horrible, everything.
Allow me to say something, if possible, says Mr. Kondilis, the translator. It's not actually a question, but a rather minor intervention. I remember that I was translating one of the books by Leif GW Persson, the trilogy about Olof Palme. Now, at some point, his hero, Manuel Suason, is reading a book about the actual period, Niklas, that you're actually talking about in your book. About the killing of Gustavo. I mean, the King of Sweden. And Johansson makes some alliterations, where to say. The king was killed. A king that was much hated by aristocrats, by rich noble people. In other words, the so-called good people. These good people that actually managed to be in power with their swords and with their money. A society that were afraid that the actual king would take part of this power. And on the other hand, a king that artists loved a lot. because there was a lot of money that was given to arts and to artists. So the reason that he was adored by people, it is something that nobody can actually explain, because the people was the one who suffered from continuous wars, that suffered from the Swedish society, from the problems with the crops, the famine, all the illnesses of that period of 1790. That's what Johansson said in his book. But Johansson said that's what people understand, that's how people react. So I believe, Niklas, that this writer manages to describe the spirit of the 1790s. I don't know if you agree.
That may be true. I don't know how beloved King Gustav III ever was during the time, actually. Rather, it seems like the sort of the romanticized image of his time is sort of something that was created way later, when there was a nationalistic wave in Sweden, and people thought it fruitful to describe. I mean, he met his end at a masked ball and was shot in the back. Very romantic. You can do stuff with that, easily dramatized. But actually, nobody was very happy with him. He ruined the kingdom by a war with Russia that Sweden technically won, but all it did was cost money. We didn't gain anything from it. He was terrified that the French Revolution would spread to Sweden, so he repressed that a lot. And he also tried to sort of transfer money from the nobility, which had all the money, to the growing bourgeoisie, because he was terrified that was where the thoughts of the revolution would spring up. And actually, the nobility, us, we killed him.
Gregory. Is there anything else you wish to ask? And we could also like to hear afterwards, to give some time to hear some things about his new book, the book he's about to write. So I would like to say that in 1794, your second book, in other words, of this trilogy, your technique of writing evolves. You use the technique by separating the book in 4 different chapters, in other words, 4 parallel stories with 4 protagonists. The first we have Eric de Rosser, the second Jean-Michel Cardel, which is a hero of 1793. The third part, we see Anna Stina Knapp, who is a widow of Cartel. And in the 4th chapter, 4th part, we see that these 3 previous stories converge. In other words, talk like 3 small rivers that get and mix in a huge, big river. And we arrive at the culmination, let's say, which is the 4th chapter. So, this is something that you use, Niklas, in your second book. I think we didn't see it in the first book, and this shows, I guess, the evolution of your writing. And it would be really interesting to hear how much time did it take between the first and the second book. And as Grigoris Kondylis said, how much time we should wait for your third book, which will actually, let's say, close this trilogy. So I see an culmination and evolution of the way you write the books and how you see this adventure of writing. And I would also like to refer to the fact that this book is not a police fiction, it is not a historical book, it is not a social narration, it is not a psychological book, it is all of the above. It is a multi-level fiction book In my critique, I said that it is like a polymorphic, an MPV car, which has, in other words, multiple functions and usages, where the writer, in other words, Niklas Natokdag, has managed to add many different forces that converge at a single point and offers a unique outcome, which becomes even greater due to the fact that it goes back at a period that nobody could have ever imagined. In other words, there might be some old people that might have some memories from these old times, but Niklas managed to depict the 1790s in a magnificent way. For example, Grigoris Kondylis, I was really amazed to see the fact that in winter there were no burials in Sweden. They could not be buried because temperatures were so low and snow was that high and the land was so dry that they could not dig and bury people. And people waited for spring for the snow to melt in order to be buried. So this is a minor, I dare to say, detail, but a magnificent detail. When I read it, I was really amazed to see how well Niklas managed to trace such a minor detail. So I don't know if you wish to say something else to Niklas. No, I can see him, that's okay. Allow me to say just 2 words, and then Niklas can close the whole discussion by also saying a few words, if actually he wishes, about his third book, because you're running out of time, to be honest. So let me just take the relay from what I just said. We do not know, and we do not have from that era, from that period, things. So we do not know words, language. We do not have the linguistic means. So that's what actually Niklas did. He managed to trace back time, life, and words. And of course, issues of the actual society. I don't know how could I actually trace back some, let's say, Greek words from that period, if I wanted to, in other words, make a research on the actual Greek language. It is very difficult. So from a large, let's say, research I also conducted, I found a language that was a mixture between Greek and Italian language when we had the Venetians who reigned Greece, you know, as a relic, let's say, of the old Ottoman Empire. So the so-called dialetto corfirese, in other words, a dialect that was semi-Greek, semi-Venetian. And this is where I managed to trace and find quite some, let's say, linguistic principles of the Greek language of that period. I found words that already exist even today in the people who live in the island of Corfu in Greece, which is a neighboring island to Italy, like a traversada, which means traverse, which means walking, let's say, for example. Or the word medicos, which comes from the word medic, in other words, doctor. So it was really important for me to make such a research for the 1790s. And then I said, okay, I managed to find some, let's say, solutions. But the problem is that we are in the island of St. Bartholomew and not, of course, in Greece's 1790s. So I need once again to conduct an additional research, because the research conducted by Niklas was a similar research I conducted at the same time. In other words, to find some equivalence. Niklas did that to find some historical events, some facts about the society of Sweden, but I had to do a parallel research for the language. So I had to read about the fact that Swedish people were involved in slavery in the San Bartholomew Island. They were actively involved in slavery, that they had bought the island from French people by offering free access to the Göteborg port. the gangs in Sweden, but I had to read about the things. And at the same time, I had to find the equivalent words and expressions and the utterances. There was, for example, a guardian of the actual tower, and I had to find the similar word for Greek, because that person had also some other duties. So there were quite some multifaceted difficulties I encountered. And I had to read some books. I read some researches conducted by the university related to the actual period, especially from the Ionian Islands in Greece, the neighboring islands to Italy, as I said. And there are some other Swedish words that, honestly, personally, I wasn't able to depict them adequately in Greek. And I've been working for many years with books in Swedish. You know, Esterman, Söderman. So this Malm is something very difficult to be translated into Greek. Yes, it is an area, but it's not just an area for the Swedish people and for Sweden. I explained this to my book in my introductory remarks. And then there was the word like, I don't know, governors, or some other people from the Byzantine era. So, and use some words from the old Byzantium Empire in a Swedish book. So whatever actually came up were things that, let's say, I found from some micro compromise I had to make. In other words, in some cases I was quite successful in translations, in some others I had to make some compromise. So blame me and not Nicholas for any misconcepts and mistranslations. So the last word to Nicholas. Nicholas, can you hear us? So, Nicholas, can you actually try to clarify something, because we're about to end our discussion? You could actually say a few words about your new book, and also, please, through your books, we see a rather dark image. We see a dark scenery. In your book, we see the good and the bad coexisting. We see the light and the darkness. So we see that we have the upper class and we have the lower class of people. We have the upper class who is a bad guy, and we see the lower class who is the good guy. But we see also hope. We see also light. So, Nicholas, my question as a final remark, as concisely as possible, do you believe, Nicholas, that there are these major differences between light and darkness, between good and bad? Or is there a mixture? Do we have, in other words, good people who have their bad side and vice versa? Or are we talking about a dichotomy between black and white, light and dark? Or can we decode these two sides?
I don't believe that people are either good or bad. I think that people are both. And I would say that traditionally, in Swedish noir literature, when you're describing this stratified society, naturally you as an author would be pretty obviously on the side of the oppressed. And I actually believe, and I think that is actually mentioned verbatim in the book, that I believe that the so-called innocent are innocent only because they are powerless to do wrong. So I don't believe that sort of the rich and mighty are naturally evil, and that the poor are naturally good. I believe that it all depends on what means your life presents to you. But as for your previous question, the 1795 is supposed to come out in Sweden in next September, I think. So, and I've been working on it for a year, so I'm in my sort of I'm starting my year of revisions now, and I've been sort of doing I'm finishing up the second rewrite of the script. And the first rewrite for me is basically something I have to do to show myself that the original ideas that I had are not as good as I thought. So, but I need to see them on paper, and then I can say, wow, this is not good at all, and then I can sort of rewrite. But hopefully I will be on time, I think.
Υπάρχει περίπτωση...
Νίκλας, να ρωτήσω κάτι.
Nicholas, I have a question. I think that you have offered a greater weight on your book on depicting the psychological profile of your characters. In other words, all your characters, especially main characters and secondary characters in your books, it seems that you have worked a lot their psychological profile. So leaving aside the historical research you have conducted, do you have an additional help from, I don't know, from psychologists, from psychiatrists, or are things that you work by yourselves, or do you have access to some, I don't know, special people who have helped you? As I said, psychologists, psychiatrists, I don't know.
I will take that as a compliment, but no. What usually happens for me is that I have a clear idea when I start writing the manuscript. I know sort of the start and the finish, and then there has to be a lot of stuff happening in between, which I work out as I go along. And as I finish that first draft, it will turn out that the characters haven't become what I wanted them to be. For instance, you read sort of the ending scene of a certain character and you don't cry. And you have to think about, okay, I'm asking for emotion here. And if I don't cry, certainly nobody else will. So I have to sort of redesign this character. And you have to go back to the beginning. Now that you know the ending scene, you have to sort of redesign the character from the bottom up to get everything, every motivation clear. And that creates sort of a ripple effect, because from that, every scene that character is featured in the whole book, will suddenly be slightly wrong with everything else that happens in the book. So that will be very frustrating as a writer, but also very rewarding, because you will lie awake for night after night and thinking, wow, I ruined the whole structure of the work. I don't know where I'm going. And suddenly you will have an idea that will be so obvious that you feel like an idiot who didn't think of that in the first place. And to me as a writer, that will create the illusion of the text having a life of its own, which of course it doesn't. But it feels like the text is bigger than what I thought originally, and that it wants to be told this story in a certain way. And that is very rewarding when you're writing something.
Πάντως, να πω κάτι, Νίκλας, ότι...
Νίκλας, έχουμε μία τελευταία ερώτηση.
Nicholas, a final question. A difficult question, but a question that comes from our hearts. When you read and when you write your books, do you have a total control of your characters, or do you believe that at a certain moment your characters become independent? They are out of your control. Do you have an autonomous character that make you write something different from what you had in mind initially?
Usually, what sort of shapes the characters actually are the source material. For instance, my main and only female character, Anastina Knapp, I think I have an idea what she will be doing, but I know I will have to do a lot of research about the actual conditions of women during this day and age. And in every part, the things that I've read has shown me that my original ideas does not really work. They are not true to the 18th century. So I have to sort of reimagine the whole thing, and it will become way better. So another lesson learned is that the historical reality of this time is often much, much stronger than anything I could imagine.
Μάλιστα. Λοιπόν, Γρηγόρη, να πω τώρα να το κλείνουμε.
Νομίζω ότι...
I guess that if you have nothing else to say, because we're running out of time, as a final note, because out of time. Nicholas, you said earlier that for somebody who has written 1794, you managed to succeed because you made us cry. There is a scene that we all cry in your book in 1794. And personally, I wish to thank you. I wish to thank you for all the support and the help you offered during the translation of both your books. and good luck, wholeheartedly good luck, for your career as a writer in the years to come. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Personally, Nicholas, allow me to say that we managed to cover in many questions of your admirers and lovers, I dare to say, and they're truly happy to hear that you will have your next book probably by September, so probably it's going to be translated, hopefully, in Greece. I hope your book will come earlier than the coronavirus vaccine. It was a great honor for us to have you with us. We had a great discussion, and we will expect your next book, and we hope that you'll be able to read even greater books to make all your admirers and your lovers globally to read your beautiful writings. So if you wish anything to add, Nicholas?
Grigoris, thank you for all your hard work. I can only imagine what a terrible time you must have been having trying to sort of, as you told us, to fit this whole story into something similar in Greek. And I will be. I hope I can make life even more difficult for you with my final book, and I'm sure the result will be great. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm extremely grateful for any reader I have in Greece. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.